Hey, my name is Jack Brennan. I'm 31, and I run a one-man furniture shop in southern Vermont. My best friend is a woman named Nora Callahan, and we've been inseparable for 12 years since we were 19. People always assumed we were together, and we always corrected them the same way. Just friends. Then, one November night, she forgot to hang up the phone, and I heard something she never meant for me to hear. What she said nearly cost me the one person I couldn't afford to lose, and saving what we had meant, saying the thing I'd been afraid to say for years. The shop sits at the end of Covered Bridge Road, about 6 miles outside Brattleboro. It's a converted barn with a wood stove in the corner, a bench along the south wall, and enough sawdust on the floor that I stopped trying to keep it clean a long time ago. I build dining tables, bookshelves, bedroom dressers, the kind of furniture people keep for a long time, nothing fancy, just solid joinery and honest wood. Pieces that look better after 10 years of use than they did the day they left the shop. I wake up at 5 most mornings, feed the dogs, start the stove, and work until the light goes. The days blur together in a way that used to bother me, and now just feels like peace. A missing screw can be replaced. A crooked joint can be reset. People are harder. I learned that early, and I've kept my life simple ever since. The dog's name is Bert. He's a 12-year-old coonhound mix who sleeps on a blanket by the stove and only moves when the delivery truck pulls in or when I accidentally drop a piece of sandpaper on his head. He's the only roommate I've had for the last 7 years, and we've got an understanding. I work, he sleeps, and neither of us asks the other for more than that. Nora Callahan came into my life when I was 19, and she lent me a pencil in a community college literature class I was taking because the shop was slow that winter and I needed something to do with my evenings. She was there because books were the only thing she loved, as much as her family's store. I gave the pencil back at the end of class, and she said I could keep it, which I figured out later was her way of making sure I'd come back the next week. After the class ended, we kept showing up in each other's lives. She'd bring her broken bookshelves to the shop, and I'd fix them for free. I'd stop by the bookstore on Main Street for coffee. She brewed in the back room before the store opened. It became a routine, and routines have a way of turning into the structure of a life before you notice it happening. Friday nights meant takeout at my kitchen table, her on one side, me on the other, Bert under the table hoping for dropped egg rolls. Sunday mornings meant coffee at the bookstore before the first customer came in, the two of us sitting on the old couch in the back while she told me about whatever novel she'd stayed up too late reading. And every December, we drove out to Henderson's farm to pick out a Christmas tree together, which always turned into an argument about whether a fir or a spruce smelled better, and always ended with whatever tree she wanted loaded onto my truck. For 12 years, that was the shape of it. Steady and easy, the kind of friendship you don't question because it just works. People in town assumed we were a couple, and we always corrected them. Just friends, I'd say, and she'd nod, and neither of us thought twice about it. I didn't date much. A few women over the years, nothing that lasted more than a couple of months. The relationships always ended the same way, with the woman telling me I didn't have room for her because I already gave all my free time to Nora. And maybe they were right, but I never saw it that way. Nora was my friend. That was different. That was separate. Except sometimes it didn't feel separate. Sometimes she'd fall asleep on my couch during a movie and I'd cover her with a blanket before I turned off the lights, and I'd stand there for a second longer than I needed to, watching the way her hair fell across her face, and then I'd go to bed and not think about it again. That was the deal I'd made with myself. Don't think about it, don't go there. She's your friend, and friends don't risk everything on a feeling they can't even name. And that worked for a long time, good at not naming things. Good at keeping the sawdust on the floor and the feelings somewhere below the surface where they couldn't get in the way of the work. The shop taught me that wood doesn't care what you're feeling. You cut a joint wrong, the table wobbles. You sand too hard, the grain opens up. There's a fairness in that. A cause and effect that doesn't bend for anyone. I liked that kind of honesty. It made the rest of life easier to handle, even if handling it meant not handling it at all. That was the life I'd built, 31 years old, a one-man shop, a dog, a best friend, and a life that ran on routine the way a well-built drawer runs on its tracks. It ran smooth and quiet, with no squeaking. And I didn't know it yet, but that smoothness was about to stop. That Friday started like every other Friday. I was in the shop late, sanding a dining table for a couple in town who'd ordered it for their anniversary. The radio played something quiet. Bert snored by the stove, and the November dark had already settled outside the windows like a curtain someone forgot to pull back. My phone rang at 7:30. It was Nora calling from her apartment to talk about Saturday. We had a farmer's market trip planned, the usual routine, walk the stalls, buy too much cheese, eat pastries on the bench by the river. "You're going to freeze tomorrow," she said. "It's supposed to be in the 30s. I'll wear my big coat." "Your big coat has a hole in the elbow." "It's ventilated," I said, and she laughed, and the conversation drifted the way it always did. From the farmer's market to a customer at the bookstore who tried to return a book because he'd already read it, to whether Bert needed a new blanket for winter. She said she'd seen one at the craft fair, hand-stitched, with a moose on it. I told her Bert would hate the moose. She said Bert would love the moose. And that was the last thing we laughed about before everything changed. "I'm going to call Delia," she said. Delia is her older sister, and they talk about holiday plans every November like it's a negotiation that never quite gets settled. "All right," I said. "I'll see you tomorrow at 8. 8, she said. "Don't be late, Jack Brennan." I never was, and she knew it. She said goodbye. I heard what I thought was the click of the call ending, and I set the phone on the workbench and went back to sanding. The table was almost done. Just the legs left, and I was working on the second one when I heard her voice again. At first, I thought the phone had dialed someone by accident. It happens sometimes. The screen still active, the call still running when you think it's over, but the phone was sitting face up on the bench, and the call timer was still counting, and Nora was talking, but not to me. She was talking to Delia, and she didn't know I could still hear her. The conversation started the way sisters talk, casual and quick, something about the turkey and who was bringing the pie. I reached for the phone to end the call, but then I heard my name, and my hands stopped. "Jack's fine," Nora said, her voice softer now, the way it gets when she's being careful with her words. "He's always fine. That's the thing about him. He's the steadiest person I know." A pause. Delia must have said something I couldn't hear, something muffled on the other end. "Because it doesn't matter," Nora said. "He doesn't see me that way, Del. He never has." Another pause, longer this time. "I know what you're going to say, and I've tried. I've tried to just be his friend. I've tried to date other people. I've tried to put it in a box and close the lid. But it doesn't stay in the box." I stood in the middle of my shop with a sanding block in my hand and the phone on the bench, and I couldn't move. The wood stove clicked in the corner. Bert shifted on his blanket. And Nora's voice kept coming through the speaker, quiet and honest in a way I'd never heard it before. "I'm in love with him," she said. "I've been in love with him for years. And every time he says, 'just friends,' it takes something out of me that I don't know how to get back." The sanding block slipped out of my hand and hit the floor, and I didn't pick it up. Delia's voice came through faintly, muffled by distance, the words impossible to make out, But I caught the shape of the question. Why don't you tell him? Nora's answer came slow, like it cost her something to say it out loud. Because he's the only person who has never left. And if I told him, and he didn't feel the same way, he'd pull away. He'd get quiet, and he'd get careful, and eventually he'd stop showing up on Fridays and stop texting me good night, and I'd lose the one thing in my life that hasn't broken yet. I can't survive that, Dell. I can't survive losing him. She went quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing, the way you hear someone breathe when they've just said something they can't take back. Then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I whispered it once when he was asleep on my couch. I said it out loud. Just once, just to know what it felt like to say it. And he didn't hear me. Thank God. Because if he knew, everything would change. Not when what we have is the only good thing I've got. I stood in my shop and I couldn't breathe. The wood stove clicked again. The radio played something I didn't recognize. And Nora's voice kept going, telling her sister things she'd never told anyone, things she'd been carrying for years in the quiet space between what she said and what she meant. The call ended a few minutes later when either Nora finally noticed the phone was still active or Delia hung up from her end and the line went dead and the screen went dark. And I stood there in the sawdust and the silence, and nothing was the same, and I had no idea what to do about it. Saturday morning came too fast. I didn't sleep that night, just lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Bert breathed beside me and the wood stove cooled to ash in the other room. By sunrise, I'd convinced myself of 100 different ways to handle what I'd heard, and by the time I got to the farmer's market, I'd thrown every single one of them away. Nora stood by the honey stall. When I found her laughing at something the vendor had said, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She looked up when I walked over, and the smile she gave me was the same smile she'd always given me. Warm and easy and unguarded, and I almost turned around and walked back to the truck. "You're late," she said. 3 minutes, I said. 3 minutes is late for Jack Brennan. I forced a smile back, and she handed me a cup of hot cider, and we walked, and everything looked the same as it always did on a Saturday at the market. The same stalls, the same vendors, the same crowd of people bundled up against the November cold. But nothing felt the same because now I knew something I wasn't supposed to know, and every time she looked at me, I could hear her voice from the phone saying my name like it was the hardest word she'd ever had to say. I started noticing things I'd never let myself notice before, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking about something she didn't want to say out loud. The specific sound of her laugh when something genuinely surprised her, different from the polite laugh she used with customers at the store. How she always reached for my arm when she was worried she might slip on the ice, her fingers closing around my sleeve like it was the most natural thing in the world. And it was natural. It had always been natural. But now I couldn't look at any of it without seeing what was underneath, and the weight of that was more than I knew how to carry. Wednesday night, the plane caught a knot, and a board split down the middle, and I stood there looking at the ruined cherry and thought about how that's what happens when you force the grain instead of reading it. Push too hard, and it breaks instead of bends. A week went by. We had our usual Friday night takeout at my place, and I spent the whole evening fighting the urge to say something, anything, that would make the air between us feel honest again. She sat on my couch, feet tucked under the blanket I'd bought for her, specifically because she always got cold, telling me about a customer at the bookstore who'd spent an hour in the poetry section without buying anything. And all I could hear was her voice on the phone, quiet and raw, saying she'd been in love with me for years, and every time I said, just friends, it took something out of her. I started pulling back after that. I canceled Sunday coffee. with a weak excuse about a deadline on the anniversary table, even though the table had been done for 3 days. I didn't text her goodnight like I usually did. When she called on Tuesday, I let it go to voicemail and texted her back an hour later with something short and neutral that sounded like it came from a stranger. I told myself I was protecting her, giving myself space to figure out what I felt, what I wanted, whether the thing that was rising in my chest every time I thought about her was real, or just a reflex from hearing something you're not supposed to hear. But really, I was afraid. I was afraid because the feeling wasn't new. It had been there for a long time, sitting quiet underneath everything else, and I'd spent 12 years pretending it wasn't. And now that she'd said it out loud, even though she hadn't said it to me, I couldn't pretend anymore. That was the worst part. Not that she loved me, but that I might feel the same way, and that saying it out loud could break the only good thing either of us had. I stopped by the bookstore the following Thursday to pick up a book she'd saved for me, a collection of essays about craftsmanship that she'd found in the back room and thought I'd like. She stood behind the counter when I walked in, and she looked up and smiled, and for a fraction of a second, the smile faltered. She could feel the distance I was putting between us, and she didn't understand it, and the confusion in her eyes was worse than if she'd been angry. "Hey," she said, "I didn't think you were coming in today." "You saved me a book," I said. "So I came to get it." She reached under the counter and set it on the surface between us. Our fingers almost touched when I picked it up, and she pulled her hand back just slightly, and I saw the warmth drain from her face for just a moment before she forced it back. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just busy with the holiday orders." She nodded slowly. "Okay. Well, let me know if you need anything." I nodded too, and I left. And the bells on the door rang behind me, and I stood on the sidewalk in the cold and realized that I was already doing the thing she was afraid of. I was pulling away and becoming careful and quiet, and eventually I'd stopped showing up on Fridays, and she'd lose the one thing in her life that hadn't broken yet. I drove back to the shop and sat in my truck for 10 minutes before I went inside. The table was done, the joinery was clean, and I had nothing left to work on that couldn't wait until Monday. So I fed Bert and made a sandwich and sat at my kitchen table where Nora and I ate takeout every Friday night, and I stared at the chair she always sat in, and I tried to imagine what it would look like if that chair was empty for good. That was the thing about routine. It doesn't announce itself as love. It just shows up week after week until the shape of your life is built around another person, and you don't notice until someone asks you to imagine the shape without them. And I couldn't. I couldn't imagine it without her. But I also couldn't figure out how to tell her what I knew without breaking something. If I told her I'd overheard the call, she'd be embarrassed and she'd pull away out of shame. If I told her I felt the same way, she might not believe me, might think I was just saying it because the friendship was too important to lose, not because it was true. And that would be worse than never saying it at all. So I said nothing. And the silence between us grew, and the more it grew, the more it felt like the very thing I was trying to prevent. 2 weeks after the call, Nora showed up at my shop. This had never happened before. She always called first, always checked whether I was in the middle of something, always respected the boundary between her world and mine, with a kind of care that I'd never fully appreciated until it was gone. But that Tuesday afternoon, she drove out to Covered Bridge Road in the rain and stood in the doorway of my shop with her coat damp and her hands shoved in her pockets. And she looked at me like she was trying to read something written in a language she used to know. "What's going on with you?" she asked. I was at the bench chiseling a mortise joint for a bookshelf order, and when she appeared in the doorway, I set the chisel down. What do you mean? You know what I mean. You've been distant for 2 weeks. You canceled Sunday. You didn't text me good night once. When I call, you sound like you're reading off a card. And today, you didn't call at all. I wiped my hands on my apron. Holiday orders. The holiday orders weren't this busy last year. This year's different. Jack. She said my name with a weight that made me look up. Her eyes were steady and searching, and there was something fragile underneath them, something she was holding together by sheer force of will. Did I do something wrong? She hadn't done anything wrong, and that was the truth. She told her sister how she felt in what she thought was a private conversation, and I was the one who'd kept listening, and I was the one who couldn't figure out what to do with what I'd heard. I'm not leaving, I said. I just need some time to figure something out. Figure what out? I looked at her standing in the doorway of my shop, with rain on her shoulders and worry in her face. And the truth was, right there, sitting on my tongue like a splinter, I couldn't swallow and couldn't spit out. But the words wouldn't come. Not like this, not standing in sawdust, with the radio off and the dog watching from the corner. I'll call you tomorrow, I said. She looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded slowly, the way you nod when you're accepting something you don't want to accept. Okay, she said. But her voice was small and careful in a way I'd never heard from her before, and when she turned to walk back to her car, I almost said it, almost told her right there in the rain. But the words caught in my throat, and I let her go, and I stood in the doorway of my shop and watched her headlights disappear down Covered Bridge Road. That night, I sat on my porch with a beer I didn't drink. It went flat while I sat there, which seemed about right for the kind of evening I was having, and I thought about what she'd said on the phone to Delia. He's the only person who has never left, and I realized that by pulling away, I was doing the exact thing she was afraid of. I was leaving. Not in the way she meant, not moving away or ending the friendship with words, but leaving in the way that matters most, the slow, quiet kind, where you stop showing up and stop texting goodnight and start treating the person who matters most like someone you used to know. A few days passed and Nora stopped reaching out. She didn't cancel Sunday coffee. She just didn't mention it. When I went to the bookstore to drop off a repaired shelf she'd asked about weeks ago, she was polite but distant, the way you'd be with a neighbor you nod to, but don't really know. She thanked me for the work, asked about my mother once, and then found a reason to go to the back room, and I stood there in the store I'd been coming to for 12 years, and it felt like a place I didn't belong anymore. That was when I understood. I was losing her either way. If I told her the truth, it might ruin everything. If I didn't, the silence would ruin it instead. The only difference was speed. One was fast and loud. The other was slow and quiet. And both of them ended in the same place, with an empty chair at my kitchen table and a gap in my Fridays that nothing else could fill. I drove home that night and fed Bert and stood in my shop for a long time, looking at the workbench where the phone had sat that Friday night, and I thought about the sound of her voice when she said my name and the way it cracked on the word love and the way she whispered it when she thought I was sleeping. And I thought about the 12 years of Friday nights and Sunday mornings and Christmas trees and all the small, ordinary things that add up to a life you didn't know you were building. And I knew what I had to do. I just had to find the courage to do it. I drove to Nora's house on a Thursday evening in late November. The sky was the color of old concrete and the temperature had dropped into the 20s, but I didn't notice the cold because I was too busy trying to remember how to breathe. Her house is a small, white farmhouse on the edge of town, the one she grew up in, with a porch that wraps around the front and a light over the door. That always made me think of the kind of house you see in stories about people coming home. I sat in my truck for a long time before I got out. Bert sat in the passenger seat, watching me with the patient confusion of a dog who doesn't understand why you'd sit somewhere without getting out. I left him in the truck with the window cracked and walked to the door. She opened it on the second knock, and the surprise on her face was immediate and unguarded. I hadn't called ahead. I hadn't warned her. I just showed up on her porch in the cold, and for a moment we stood there, looking at each other across the threshold. And I saw the wall she'd built between us over the last 2 weeks, and I saw the hurt underneath it, and I saw something else too, something she couldn't hide no matter how hard she tried. And it was the same thing I'd heard in her voice on the phone that Friday night. "Can we sit on the porch?" I asked. She nodded and stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind her. We sat on the old wooden bench under the porch light, and the cold November air sat between us like a third person. Neither of us had invited. I didn't know how to start. I'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in my head during the sleepless nights and the quiet drives and the long hours at the workbench, and every version sounded wrong. So I just said the first true thing I could find. "You didn't hang up the phone," I said. She went still. Not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of someone who has been carrying something for years and just felt the ground give way beneath her. The Friday night we talked about the farmer's market. I said, "You said you were going to call Delia. You thought you hung up." "You didn't." The call was still live and I heard everything. Nora's hands rested in her lap and I watched them grip each other like she was holding on to something that might float away. She didn't look at me. She looked at the ground, at the porch boards, at anything that wasn't my face. "Jack," she said, her voice shaking, and she started to explain, started to apologize, the words coming fast like she'd been waiting for this moment and dreading it at the same time. I stopped her, quietly, gently. I said her name, just her name. And she looked up. "The night you whispered it while I was asleep on your couch," I said. "I didn't hear it then, but I hear it now. And I need you to know something." She looked at me and her eyes were wide and raw and full of the kind of fear that comes from standing at the edge of something you can't take back. "I feel it too," I said. "I felt it for a long time. I was afraid of it, and I've been running from it. And my running almost cost me the one person who has never left. I'm sorry for the distance. I'm sorry for the silence. I'm sorry it took me this long to say what I should have said a long time ago." She didn't speak for a long time. The porch light hummed above us. A car passed on the road below, headlights sweeping across the yard and disappearing into the dark. The cold didn't seem to matter anymore, or maybe we'd both just stopped noticing it. Then she looked at me, and the way she looked at me was different from every look before it. It was the same eyes, the same face, the same person I'd known for 12 years, but it was the first time she was letting me see all of it without the wall, without the careful distance, without the version of herself she'd built to keep me safe from the truth. Neither of us said anything for a while. We just sat there on the porch bench under the light, and the silence between us was different from the silence of the last 2 weeks. This silence didn't hurt. This silence was the kind that comes after something heavy has been set down, and the air around it finally has room to breathe. The porch light hummed above us, and the cold didn't matter anymore. The life I'd spent years building alone had room in it for someone else. And all it took to find that out was the courage to stop pretending otherwise. That was enough.